Hi people, it's Archivist here, and I'm finally going to do a review for a next generation console. And today I'm going to be focusing on the Xbox Series X. And in the background you're going to see some footage taken from the Series X, just to give some context to my words. Unfortunately, it's not the full fat 4K that's actually coming from the console. My capture card is a little bit old now and a little bit outdated, so it can't capture 4K, it's only 1080p 60. So please don't take it as a full one-to-one of what you can experience in these games. I think the high frame rate of 60 at least should give you an idea where you can see frame rate boosts over previous generations. So, the Series X. I am really enjoying this console. It is a hassle-free device. I previously owned an Xbox One X and I really enjoyed that console, and I just wanted to get something that was an upgrade to that, something that was an incremental improvement, and that's absolutely what the Series X feels like, for better or worse. It doesn't really, in my opinion at least, feel like a generational leap in the traditional sense, in that the user interface is the same, the games you can play are the same, but that does mean that we aren't getting all of those learning curves and new troubles that you might have in a new generation. It's all just effortlessly carrying over from the previous generation, and that continuity has made learning the Xbox Series X effectively a non-thing for me, because it's operating exactly how the Xbox One X did. So if you own an Xbox One X and you're concerned about having to understand a new device with the Series X, you don't have to worry at all, because it operates effectively the same. It's just a lot more powerful. And of all the different upgrades it has, the SSD is by far the most noticeable, because it improves load times a great deal. We've gone from a conventional low-speed spinning disk on the One X, which was otherwise quite a powerful console, but it was let down by that, and now the SSD is just blazing fast, and you're seeing loading speeds that are significantly faster, like not just a little bit, but multiple times faster than they used to be. And I don't want to say that that revolutionizes the gaming experience, because in reality you're just waiting less time to play a game. I haven't seen anything on the Series X that takes advantage of it in a gameplay sense, but in terms of making the overall Xbox experience more fluid, I guess you could say, it's very much appreciated. And also, someone who's a PC gamer, it was absolutely the thing that I noticed the most whenever I went from my PC, which uses an SSD, to my consoles. It was the thing I always had to adapt to, and it was very noticeable that the consoles were so much slower. But now I would actually say maybe my PC needs an upgrade, but my Xbox does feel a little bit snappier than my PC now, although of course that is a full desktop operating system, and this is dedicated to gaming, so it will be helped out in that respect. But then there's also the CPU upgrade, which is a big thing, because the One X was a great console with a very beefy GPU. However, it was let down by that notoriously bottleneck Jaguar CPU, which meant that there were certain games where it would just not run very well because they were more CPU dependent than GPU dependent. And now that is an issue that has, for the time being at least, gone away, because the CPU has been massively upgraded. The GPU has of course been upgraded. It's, the graphics of the console are way more capable than the previous gen, but I think what I'm appreciating most is that the weaknesses of last gen have been addressed very appropriately. The CPU was a bottleneck and the hard drive felt very slow. Both have been risen up, and the GPU is just, it's a good advantage. And we're seeing games having identical graphics but going from, say, 30 frames per second in the last gen to 60 frames per second. So Man-Eater is a great example of that, where I played this last year on the One X, and it was a 4K experience, quite nice to the eye. However, it did run at 30 FPS, which wasn't great. And the Series X just flat out doubles that frame rate. And this is the thing though, in terms of games improving. So this was a situation where this game was optimized for Series X and indeed Series S, and that means it will take advantage of the new hardware. But there are plenty of games that don't do this, at least in a direct sense like this. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a game that looks absolutely stunning even now, but the thing is, it did look stunning on the One X as well, so visually there's been no changes. The only differences for Red Dead that I find are quite nice with the Series X are the reduced loading times, because that initial load time is quite egregious on the previous generation. But also, there were a few areas where it tended to drop below 30 frames per second in some of the busier locations, but with the Series X it just tightens up that lock, so we're still seeing 30 frames per second, but it's a far more consistent 30 frames per second. And that actually also brings me on to a great thing I'm finding with some newer games on the Series X, is that it does feel like we're starting to move towards 60 FPS being a new standard, and it really has to be, because in order for this console to sell 120 frames per second, it needs to start standardizing 60, whereas previously we did see a lot of 30 FPS games on the last generation. And the thing is, the interesting aspect to this is that 30 FPS is very much a choice. At the end of the day, it's the developer's choice whether they want to use the hardware budget on visuals like ray tracing resolution, or do they want to use it in frame rate. So we are technically just as likely this gen to see 30 frames per second, because the hardware, it can be utilized however a developer sees fit, but we do seem to be seeing a lot of choices to actually make 60 FPS the standard with a bonus of 120. Unfortunately, I've not been able to experience the 120 FPS side of the Series X because, well, quite frankly, I don't have a 120 FPS screen yet. Anyway, I do plan to upgrade at some point. I did get a halfway point monitor though, which has a feature called VRR, or variable refresh rate. This is actually not a new feature to the Series X. Strictly speaking, this was on the One X. However, this is the first time I'm experiencing it because I've only just got this monitor. And I will tell you, it's absolutely worth investing in a TV or a monitor that has variable refresh rate. The best example I've seen so far will actually be Resident Evil Village, funnily enough, which has a ray tracing mode that you can enable. Now, strictly speaking, the frame rate is dropping regularly from 60. And when I went to capture the footage, I actually noticed that quite stand out. It's definitely not a constant 60. However, when I was playing it through, just to enjoy it myself, I noticed that the VRR completely cleaned it up, and it, to my eye at least, did feel like it was running at 60 FPS, and I was obviously mistaken, but the fact I thought it was running at 60 FPS almost constantly because the VRR was so effective, well, to me that's a game-changing experience. It's brilliant. There are limitations around it. You can't really have a game going down to 40 FPS, for example, regularly. VRR might be able to slightly even that out, but it's going to be noticeable something's happening. But for those games that are in the 50 to 60 FPS range, previously, even if you saw a single frame drop, it would be noticeable because there would be a bit of a stutter on the frame time. But with VRR, it matches the refresh rate, and it just, to the eye, looks much better. So if you don't have a VRR screen yet, I would actually recommend it, because for games like Resident Evil Village, it does change the experience more than I expected it would. So yeah, it's a great feature. It is nice to be able to go back to games that I thought ran okay on the Xbox One X, but I always felt that they were just a little bit off what I wanted them to be in terms of performance, and a great example of that would be Star Wars Battlefront 2. It ran well and looked very nice on the One X. I mean, it was actually the first game I got on the One X, and I remember thinking at the time, visually it looked fantastic, and the campaign was pretty much perfect. But if you went into some of the larger battles, the frame rate could definitely go down a little bit, and it was a little bit distracting, and naturally you don't want that when you're playing competitively online. But playing on the Series X, the game looks gorgeous. I don't know if it actually had any upgrades, but it just looks great, I guess, in its own right. But the frame rate appears to, for all I can see, been utterly perfected to 60, which in those larger battles just makes it so much more immersive that you're not having to worry about that aspect of things. So it can make games in that regard that were just slightly off the mark before, make them actually run at a perfect 60. There's fantastic things to say about backwards compatibility. I was going back to Titanfall 2 after someone recommended to me that it's actually had a bit of a resurgence in terms of its multiplayer, which really warmed my heart, because Titanfall 2, I really was a champion for that game when it came out, but no one seemed to care. I think it's quite well known that it had a very poor launch window in between Call of Duty and Battlefield and got sort of forgotten, but there are plenty of people who are aware that it is a fantastic game and it's actually gaining more traction now, so I would wholeheartedly recommend it. And it's just great that when I decided I want to play it, I downloaded Titanfall 2 because I already had it on the Xbox One X, and it takes a second to sync my saves, and then it was right back where I left it. And that is something that I really do appreciate about the backwards compatibility element of this new device. It's not just being able to go back and play this game sometimes at higher frame rates, but also it truly is seamless. It's like another random example was Dragon Ball Z Kakarot. I just reinstalled it because I wanted to play some DLC, and I just picked up exactly where I left off. Really, in terms of picking up where I left off, I've had no friction at all. It's just, again, sort of for better or worse, it's almost like I'm still on the Xbox One X, but the internals have been massively upgraded. An interesting thing you can do with the Series X, which has led to me using it quite a lot, is you can buy this rather expensive but incredibly effective storage expansion card, which adds 1 terabyte to the console, and it's just as fast as the internal storage. So when you plug it in, it's essentially like you're just adding to the overall storage pool, and you can choose to make it your default install location, which I've done if you wish, or you can just choose it when your internal storage runs out. And the great thing about it is this effectively gives you approximately 2 terabytes of storage. Of course, you have to account for the operating system and other things, but approximately 2 terabytes of storage. And the excellent thing is, if you don't really have a preference on where you play a game, say you've got a PS5, you've got a Switch, you've got a PC, and you've got the Series X, and you don't really care where you play it, it's funny that when you just have a lot of storage, you end up choosing that device because obviously it then takes away less from the games you would want to play on it. So I have played on the Series X a lot more than I thought I would, just because it has so much storage in it. Even though it is a bit expensive to do it, it definitely led to me using the console quite a lot. And it's nice to not have to micromanage the games on it as much as I used to. Because I didn't have the card immediately, I left it a few months and then got it, and I felt it definitely elevated the console. Even though the internal storage, it is adequate, you can get away with it, it's a good amount. It's not like the Series S, for example, where arguably it's right on the verge of what is actually acceptable to have as an amount of storage in a modern console. So you'll notice I've made a lot of comparisons here to the Xbox One X. I mean, firstly, it's because the one I used to own, so it makes the sense to make such comparisons. But I think that is an important thing to consider because we naturally have 2 consoles in the Xbox space right now. There's the Series S and the Series X, and I can't speak too much to the Series S because I have no calls to own one. But if you are coming from an Xbox One S, arguably you could save yourself some money and go with the Series S, because I see them as 2 logical upgrade paths, where Xbox One S owners might be inclined to go down the Series S path because they will still see that as a massive improvement, and then the One X owners are going to go for the Series X, which I really would recommend doing that because the Series S has a lot of these next generation features like the faster SSD and the more powerful CPU, but the GPU is actually more powerful on the Xbox One X, and there are lots of games which actually run at a higher resolution on the One X. So I feel like if you went to the Series S side of it, you might actually feel like in some respects, not all, but in some respects, it's a little bit of a downgrade. Of course, if you're someone who has an Xbox One S and you're going to the Xbox Series X, wow, you are going to see a crazy upgrade. And well, yeah, I recommend doing it just for that, because the jump between either the base Xbox One or the One S and the Series X, the difference in power is absolutely immense. I almost wished I hadn't gotten the One X now, because it would have meant that if I'd have done that jump, I would have been able to appreciate it massively. Like it's night and day difference. One thing that I really want to mention as well, where it might seem like a small thing, but I really appreciate it and am very impressed at Microsoft for accomplishing it, but the Xbox Series X is whisper quiet. You can barely hear it even when it's playing the most demanding of games. A quick caveat though, when you first turn it on, if you have a disc in the disc drive, it does rev up for a bit, maybe 3 minutes or so, but After it's done that, it will calm down eventually. If you launch the game that was in there, it can spin it up a little bit as well. But after that very brief period of time, the Xbox goes back into just utter silence. And something that's quite funny is I thought it was making like a whining noise for a bit, but it turned out the Series X was so quiet, what I was hearing was the noise of my monitor, which I'd never heard before because the other devices that are plugged into it would always overpower the sound. So it is incredibly quiet, and I think Microsoft have done an absolutely amazing job on the engineering side, and I just hope there isn't some downside to this, where is it actually expelling enough heat from the console? I really hope so, because I'd hate for it to turn out to be a massive engineering fault where actually it's not expelling enough heat and then it fails. Like, I don't really want that at all, but I have no reason to believe that at the moment, so I'm just going to praise Microsoft for making it so quiet. I'm definitely a bit OCD on electronic noises, probably more than I should be, and the fact that the Series X is just absolutely silent, okay, unless you put your ear to it and you right on a fan, obviously you can hear something there. It's not an unnatural device, but it is for all intents and purposes it's silent or just inaudible, I think is the way to say it. If you had a One X, that was a very quiet device too in terms of its power, but if I played something like Red Dead Redemption 2, I would absolutely notice the fans kicking in every now and then. But with this, no, just nothing. Outside, again, of the disk drive, when you first put something in, it does rev up. But again, I forgive it completely because it's over so quickly. It's not a long-term issue. I haven't mentioned Game Pass in this video, and you might be wondering why, because everyone seems to bring up Game Pass as like the #1 reason to own an Xbox, and it's because I don't have it, which probably sounds crazy, and I absolutely see myself getting it at some point in the future, maybe before Halo Infinite. But the thing is, there's never been a point where a game has come to Game Pass that I really wanted, but I didn't already own it. I've just buy most of my games. I do like owning my library. And so to me, Game Pass, I can absolutely see why to some people it's a winner. Like, especially maybe if you're a parent and you want to give the console to your kids, you can basically just subscribe to Game Pass and you'll know that they're just going to have so much variety and you don't have to worry too much about the individual purchases. I can objectively appreciate Game Pass, but I don't use it myself due to just the way that I prefer to buy games individually. Sometimes, even if it costs me a bit more, but I could very easily end up changing that behavior in the future, to be honest. Like, I do pay for Xbox Live, so it's not like I'm not paying for a subscription already. So yeah, I can definitely see myself using it at some point. The controller. This is the thing, right? Controller for the Xbox, I love it because of the ergonomics. The ergonomics of the controller really fit me, and I think the crucial thing is I'm just used to it. And although there's a lot to be said for the innovations with the DualSense, it's a very new controller. I do sometimes think that the best controller is one you're familiar with, because that's where your muscle memory is mapped to. So if you need to pull like an advanced maneuver in a game, if you already understand the language of the controller and you're used to an Xbox One controller, then you're going to be able to do it with little to no issue. The only real differences are the share button, which I don't think I've ever used. The D-pad is a little bit clickier with a slightly different design, and there's a texture on the back on the triggers and the grips in order to make it a little bit easier to hold on to. I actually don't like that, but I think I might be I might be on my own in that, because I think most people do enjoy the grip. They like the fact it's easier to hold, but I just find it a bit rough, and I had no issues holding the previous one. So that is one thing I actually prefer about the standard Xbox One controller. I don't actually like the textured back. USB-C. Forgot about it. USB-C is also on the controller, so you can charge it a bit easier if indeed you do get the charging pack. Before I come to the end of the video, one final thing I'll talk about is quick resume. So this is the ability to switch between games rapidly, so they'll be suspended in memory and then you can come back to a game later. But unlike the previous console, the One X, where you could do that in terms of putting the Xbox into low power mode and then you could come back to it, now you can actually switch between different games and come back to them. I don't think it's a killer feature, if I'm completely honest. Reasons being, it's unreliable. Like, you don't actually know when it's going to happen. You're not choosing to put a game into quick resume mode, it just happens. And also, I'm finding enough quirks with games where the weirdest stuff will happen. It will either just disconnect you from the online, so you pretty much have to restart the game anyway, or the weirdest thing in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where if I return to the game from quick resume, I don't know why, and I'm sure it's a bug that will be gotten rid of, because this wasn't actually a bug a while ago, so it must be a new bug. But for some reason, all my clothes disappear and I lose my armor, so I have to reload a previous save. But yeah, it's not a bad feature. It's obviously a good feature, and it's very useful when it happens, when you do want to switch back to a game. You're like, oh, I'm back where I left off. But I don't think it's like a killer feature. Like if I'm trying to convince you to upgrade from a 1X, for example, I obviously should mention it, but I don't think it's the thing that has left a massive lasting impression on me, if I'm massively honest. So not like a criticism of it, like a heavy criticism of the feature. It does work. It just, I think it's a little bit of its own mind for me to be too happy with, I guess you could say. So I think that's the last thing I can think to talk about, at least in this initial review of the Xbox Series X. It's the kind of thing where naturally year on year you can be coming back to it. If you enjoyed it, thought it was informative, maybe just giving my perspective. There are of course thousands of reviews out there on this device, but just another opinion in the pot. You know, it gives more texture to your buying decision, or just a discussion. It could be interesting. If you want to see a similar video to this, maybe on the PlayStation 5, drop a like and subscribe, and let me know. As always, people, thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.